Have you ever come home expecting a little peace, only to find someone's decided to make your life a personal project? That was me, fresh off a grueling assignment. All I wanted was quiet, a chance to decompress from the kind of stress that eats at your soul if you let it. My new house in Serene Meadows was supposed to be that sanctuary. I'd bought it through a relocation service, sight unseen mostly, while I was still deep undercover on a case that had stretched on for far too long. All I knew was that it was suburban, reputedly tranquil, and blessedly anonymous. But my HOA president, a woman whose actual name was Brenda McMillan, but whom I privately began to think of as the gatekeeper of grievances, had other plans. Specifically, for my classic Ford LTD. She probably thought I was just some new guy, easy to intimidate, another notch on her clipboard of petty tyrannies. She had no idea who she was dealing with, or what that car, a dark blue 1978 sedan, really represented. It wasn't just metal and chrome. It was a link to my father, a reminder of simpler times before my life became a series of carefully constructed identities. Before I tell you how one ill-advised tow call unraveled her entire reign of terror in our little community, let me know in the comments. What's the wildest HOA story you've ever heard or experienced? I'm Marcus Thorne, though most people in Serene Meadows just knew me as Mark, the quiet fellow who'd moved into the Miller house. And this is how my quiet suburban street became the front line of a battle I never asked for, but one I was, as it turned out, uniquely qualified to fight. I'd only been in Serene Meadows for about a week. The unpacking was slow, my energy levels still recovering. My body was on mandatory leave, but my mind hadn't quite gotten the memo. It was still cataloging exits, assessing threat levels in the grocery store, making me the kind of new neighbor who probably seemed a bit aloof. The Ford LTD, my dad's old car, was parked on the street in front of my house. I just brought it back from a specialist mechanic who worked on these older models, making sure it was running smooth after its journey to the new place. I was planning to clear space in the garage that afternoon. It was parked legally, as far as any cursory glance at the curb indicated. No yellow lines, no fire hydrant, no signs prohibiting it. I was inside for maybe 2 hours, wrestling with a particularly stubborn flat-pack bookshelf, when I heard the distinct groan of a hydraulic lift and the clank of chains. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. That's a tow truck. I walked out the front door, and sure enough, a greasy-looking flatbed was angling away from the curb, my Ford already secured and looking forlorn. Standing on her perfectly manicured lawn across the street, arms crossed, clipboard predictably in hand, was Brenda McMillan. She had this look of smug satisfaction, the kind that people who derive pleasure from the minor miseries of others wear like a medal. Her blonde hair was sculpted into a helmet that probably wouldn't move in a hurricane, and her pastel pantsuit looked like it was starched with liquid disapproval. "Looking for something, Mr. Thorne?" she called out, her voice carrying an edge of feigned politeness that didn't quite mask the triumph. "That's my car," I said, keeping my voice level, though a familiar coldness was starting to seep into my veins. This wasn't the high-stakes pressure of a bust going sideways, but it was an injustice, petty and infuriating. "Was your car," she corrected, a thin smile playing on her lips. "It was parked in violation of HOA Regulation 7, subsection B, paragraph 4. No vehicle shall be parked on community roadways for a period exceeding 1 hour during daylight hours." It's all in the welcome packet I had delivered. I vaguely remembered a thick binder dropped on my doorstep, full of arcane rules. 1 hour? I was just getting it settled. No warning? No knock on the door? Brenda scoffed. "We don't provide a personalized concierge service for rule breakers, Mr. Thorne. Ignorance of the bylaws is not an excuse. You'll find the details for Shady Grove towing on the sign at the community entrance. I suggest you retrieve it promptly. Their storage fees are quite motivating." She practically purred the last word. My jaw tightened. Shady Grove towing. Sounds delightful. I glanced at the community entrance sign, barely visible from my property. It was small, cluttered with other information, and the towing company details were in the finest print imaginable. This was deliberate. This was predatory. "And you are?" I asked, though I had a strong suspicion. Brenda McMillan, president of the Serene Meadows Homeowners Association, she announced, as if presenting a royal title. And I take our community standards very seriously. I bet you do, I thought, especially the ones you can twist to your advantage. This wasn't just about a car or a misread rule. This was about power. Her power over me, over this community. And in that moment, something inside me, something I've been trying to keep dormant during my leave, flickered to life. The investigator. The part of me that doesn't let go of inconsistencies, that unravels tangled threads. Brenda McMillan had just made a very big mistake. She'd mistaken my desire for peace for weakness. My first step was to retrieve the LTD. I call it rideshare, my mind already working, compartmentalizing my anger and focusing on process. The Shady Grove towing yard was exactly as its name suggested, a dilapidated lot on the industrial outskirts of town, surrounded by a listing chain-link fence topped with more rust than barbed wire. The office was a grubby trailer. The attendant, a burly man with faded tattoos and a disposition that suggested he gargled with gravel, grunted when I stated my business. The fee was exorbitant, just as Brenda had gleefully implied. $350 for a tow of less than 2 miles and less than an hour in their care. I paid it, making sure to get a meticulously detailed receipt. I noted the driver's name from his ID badge, Dwayne. I noted the lack of any visible business license displayed in the office. I took photos of my car on my phone before they unhooked it, documenting its condition. Dwayne watched me with a hostile curiosity. "Something wrong, pal?" he asked, his tone daring me to find fault. "Just being thorough," I replied, my voice mild. "Pal, huh? We're not pals, Dwayne." As I drove the LTD out of that yard, I felt a shift. The weariness of my last assignment was still there, but it was now overlaid with a sharp, focused indignation. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was a challenge. And Brenda McMillan, with her clipboard and her power suit, had no idea what she'd just initiated. Back home, the first thing I did was locate that HOA welcome packet. It was indeed a hefty tome, dense with legalese and petty restrictions. I found Regulation 7, subsection B, paragraph 4. It was there, as she'd said, but I also found the section on enforcement and violations. It stipulated a written warning for first-time minor infractions, with a 24-hour cure period. Towing was reserved for repeat offenders or hazardous parking situations. My car, parked neatly by the curb in broad daylight, was neither. Brenda hadn't just enforced a rule. She'd bypassed her own association's stated procedures. Interesting. My FBI training isn't just about firearms and takedowns. A huge part of it is about patience, observation, and the methodical deconstruction of complex systems, whether those systems belong to organized crime or apparently an overzealous HOA. I made a few quiet calls. Not to the Bureau, not yet. These were the contacts I had in data services, resources that could pull public records quickly and discreetly. I ran a preliminary check on Brenda McMillan and Shady Grove Towing. Brenda, it turned out, had been HOA president for 6 years, running unopposed in the last 3 elections. There were a few disgruntled online comments on local forums about her iron-fisted rule, but nothing substantial. Shady Grove Towing, however, was a different story. They had a string of complaints with the Better Business Bureau, mostly about excessive fees and allegations of damage to vehicles. Their business license was current, but barely. They seemed to specialize in HOA contracts, which struck me as a niche that could be easily exploited by someone who knew how to work the system. Someone like Brenda. Over the next few days, I became the model new resident, at least outwardly. I mowed my lawn to the precise millimeter I imagined Brenda would approve of. I sorted my recycling with an almost religious fervor. But I also watched. I learned Brenda's routine. Her morning patrol around the neighborhood, clipboard at the ready. Her afternoon coffee on her porch, surveying her domain like a feudal lord. I saw her interact with other residents. A sharp word here for a slightly overgrown rosebush. A condescending lecture there for kids playing too loudly in their own yard. Most people just nodded, their faces tight with resentment, and hurried away. There was a palpable miasma of low-grade fear and simmering frustration in Serene Meadows. One afternoon, I saw Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived a few doors down, struggling with her garden hose. I offered to help. She was frail, with kind eyes that held a hint of nervousness. As I recoiled the hose for her, she glanced furtively towards Brenda's house. "Thank you, dear," she whispered. "It's Mark, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "Glad to help." "You're the one whose car she towed," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dropping even lower. "That was awful of her. Just awful." "It wasn't pleasant," I admitted. "Does she do that often?" Mrs. Henderson wrung her hands. "Oh, Brenda, she has her rules. And if you cross her—" She trailed off, then seemed to gather a bit of courage. "She fined me $25 last month because my wind chimes were creating a noise disturbance. They were a gift from my granddaughter." Her eyes welled up slightly. "I took them down, of course. It's easier than fighting. Easier than fighting." That seemed to be the prevailing sentiment. But I wasn't looking for easy. I was looking for justice. "Mrs. Henderson," I said gently, "has anyone ever tried to challenge her on these things?" She shook her head. "A few tried, years ago. The DeVises down the street. They wanted to put up a different kind of fence. Brenda made their lives miserable. Meetings, letters, threats of liens. They eventually gave up. Most people just pay the fines or do what she says. She's relentless. Relentless." I knew the type. They fed on compliance born of intimidation. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," I said. "You've been very helpful." Her story, small as it seemed, was another piece of the puzzle. This wasn't just about one car. It was a pattern. My next visit was to the DeVises. They were a young couple, probably in their late 30s, with 2 small children. When I introduced myself and mentioned Brenda, a shadow crossed Mr. Davis's face. His wife, Sarah, invited me in, her expression wary. "We heard about your car," Tom Davis said, his voice tight. "Classic Brenda. I was hoping you could tell me about your experience with her," I said. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you had some trouble over a fence." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Trouble?" "She turned our lives into a bureaucratic nightmare for 6 months. We just wanted a slightly higher fence for privacy while within city codes. But Brenda decided it wasn't aesthetically harmonious with the community. She cited bylaws that didn't exist. Then when we pointed that out, she had the board clarify the rules, basically rewriting them to block us." "She controls the board?" I asked. "Controls it?" Tom snorted. "2 of them are her cronies, and the other one, a Mr. Abernathy, resigned in protest a couple years ago. Said he couldn't stomach the way she was running things. Since then, it's just been Brenda and her yes men." Mr. Abernathy. That was a name I needed to remember. "Do you still have any of the paperwork from that dispute?" I asked. Sarah nodded. "I keep everything. Letters, minutes from those sham meetings, her ridiculous violation notices." "What?" "I'm just trying to understand how things work around here," I said. "It seems unusual." "It's a dictatorship in miniature," Tom said, the anger still fresh in his voice. "We pay our dues, and for what? To be lorded over by that woman? If you're thinking of fighting her, good luck. You'll need it." "I'm not afraid of a fight when it's warranted," I replied, a statement that was truer than they knew. They agreed to let me look at their documents, a thick folder chronicling their frustrating battle. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. Brenda McMillan was running Serene Meadows like her own personal fiefdom, accountable to no one. Finding Mr. Abernathy was my next priority. He lived on the other side of the development. He was a retired accountant, sharp-witted and with a clear disdain for Brenda's reign. When I explained who I was and what had happened with my car, and mentioned my conversations with the Hendersons and DeVises, he listened intently, a grim smile playing on his lips. "So, the new fellow has teeth," Abernathy said, looking me over. "Brenda picked the wrong one this time, I suspect." "Yes, I resigned. Couldn't stand the way she was manipulating the finances, among other things." "Finance." I leaned forward. This was the area where petty tyrants often tripped up. "What kind of manipulation?" "Inflated invoices, contract awarded without proper bids, always to the same few preferred vendors." "Cozy, very cozy." I tried to raise concerns, but she had the votes. accused me of being disruptive. Abernathy sighed. The worst of it was the towing contract with Shady Grove. That always stank to high heaven. The rates were outrageous, and there were rumors of, let's call them finder's fees paid back to someone. But I could never prove it definitively. Kickbacks, I stated. It fit the pattern. Shady Grove gets exclusive rights, inflates prices, and Brenda gets a percentage for steering business their way, all funded by the residents she was supposed to be serving. Precisely, Abernathy confirmed. She uses the HOA accounts like her personal slush fund for community improvements that mostly benefit her property value or her friends. The landscaping contract, the holiday decorations, always overpriced, always her guys. Now we were talking. This wasn't just about arbitrary rule enforcement. This was potentially fraud. My quiet leave was officially over. Mr. Abernathy, I said, I believe Brenda McMillan is not just a bully, but she might be committing actual crimes. Would you be willing to help me look into this more deeply? And perhaps help the community take back control? Abernathy's eyes lit up with a fire I hadn't seen there before. Young man, he said, I've been waiting for someone with the guts and the sense to do just that for years. Tell me what you need. With Abernathy as my guide through the HOA's labyrinthine financials, or what little of them were transparent, and with the Devises providing documented instances of procedural abuse, and Mrs. Henderson acting as a surprisingly effective networker among other disgruntled long-term residents, our little band of insurgents began to gather evidence. I taught Tom Davis some basic forensic accounting principles, how to spot anomalies in ledgers, how to cross-reference invoices with services supposedly rendered. Sarah Davis turned out to have a knack for organizing information, creating a timeline of Brenda's questionable decisions and rule changes. My own skills came into play in ways that didn't require a badge. I used open-source intelligence techniques to build a more complete profile of Brenda and her associates, including the owner of Shady Grove Towing, a man named Vic Palmero, who had a couple of prior brushes with the law for questionable business practices in other states. I conducted discreet surveillance. Nothing invasive, just observing public interactions. One afternoon, I photographed Brenda having a very chummy lunch with Vic Palmero at an out-of-the-way diner. They weren't discussing HOA bylaws. It looked far more like two business partners reviewing figures, ending with Palmero passing Brenda a thick envelope. It was circumstantial, but compelling. Brenda, meanwhile, wasn't oblivious. She must have sensed the shift in the neighborhood's undercurrent. My car remained untouched, but I started receiving violation notices for the most ridiculous things. One for having my garden hose coiled in a non-uniform manner, another because my newspaper, delivered by a local kid, was allegedly not retrieved within 30 minutes of delivery, constituting a littering offense. Each notice was meticulously documented and filed away. She was trying to intimidate me, to bait me into an outburst. It was amateurish, frankly, like a child poking a bear with a very small stick. She also sent out a passive-aggressive HOA newsletter. It has come to the board's attention, it read, that certain individuals, perhaps new to our community standards, are sowing discord and questioning established procedures. Serene Meadows thrives on harmony and respect for the rules that protect our property values and quality of life. Frivolous complaints and attempts to undermine the board will not be tolerated. Oh, I think there will be, I thought, a grim satisfaction settling in. You're just making our case for us, Brenda. Her arrogance was her Achilles heel. She genuinely believed she was untouchable. The stakes were rising. Abernathy discovered that Brenda had recently proposed a hefty special assessment for urgent infrastructure repairs, the details of which were suspiciously vague. The amount was significant, enough to cause real hardship for many residents, including Mrs. Henderson. We suspected this was a brazen attempt to line her pockets or pay off debts before anyone could scrutinize the existing accounts too closely. This accelerated our timeline. We had to act before that assessment could be pushed through. Our plan was straightforward, leveraging the HOA's own bylaws, the ones Brenda so often ignored or twisted. We needed to call a special meeting of the homeowners. According to the rules Abernathy knew so well, a petition signed by 20% of homeowners could compel such a meeting. Our goal: present our findings, vote Brenda out of office, demand a full independent audit of the HOA finances, and terminate the contract with Shady Grove Towing. Getting the signatures was easier than I anticipated. Mrs. Henderson, transformed from a timid victim into a quiet revolutionary, rallied the older residents. The Devises spoke to younger families. My own story of the tow, now embellished with the details of the exorbitant fees and Brenda's dismissiveness, became a local legend, a symbol of her overreach. Within a week, we had signatures from nearly 40% of the homeowners. Abernathy formally submitted the petition. Brenda's reaction was predictable. First, denial. She claimed the petition was improperly formatted. Abernathy, a stickler for detail, had ensured it was perfect. Then, she tried to delay, saying the board needed time to verify the signatures, a process she clearly intended to drag out indefinitely. But the bylaws stipulated a maximum of 10 days for verification and scheduling. We sent her a legally worded letter, drafted with the help of a lawyer friend of Abernathy's, reminding her of this. Checkmate. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening in the community clubhouse. Brenda tried one last desperate maneuver. The weekend before the meeting, I found a formal-looking legal letter taped to my door. It was from a law firm, alleging defamation and threatening legal action if I continued to spread malicious falsehoods about President McMillan and the HOA. It was a bluff, and a clumsy one. The letter was full of bluster, but cited no specific instances of defamation. I filed it with a growing stack of evidence. If anything, it hardened my resolve. She was scared. Good. The evening of the special meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. More residents than I'd ever seen in one place. An air of nervous anticipation hung in the room. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by her two loyal board members, looking imperious but with a tightness around her eyes that betrayed her unease. She tried to open the meeting by launching into a lengthy diatribe about disruptive elements and the sanctity of community rules. Mr. Abernathy calmly stood up. "Madam President," he said, his voice firm and clear, "according to Robert's Rules of Order, which our bylaws stipulate we follow, the first order of business for a special meeting called by petition is to address the items outlined in said petition. Please let us proceed." Brenda's face flushed. She was used to controlling the narrative. She shot Abernathy a venomous glare, but reluctantly ceded the floor. I was nominated by Tom Davis to speak on behalf of the petitioners. I walked to the podium, carrying a slim binder. I wasn't there to shout or accuse. I was there to present facts. "Good evening, everyone." I began, my voice calm, projecting easily across the room. "My name is Mark Thorne. Many of you know about my car being towed a few weeks ago. That incident, while personally frustrating, led me and several of your neighbors to look more closely at how our HOA is being managed. What we found is deeply concerning. For the next 45 minutes, I laid it all out. I started with the improper towing procedures, showing copies of the bylaws versus the actions taken. I presented a summary of complaints against Shady Grove Towing. Then, with Abernathy's help, I walked them through the financial discrepancies, the no-bid contracts, the inflated invoices for landscaping that never seemed to match the work done, the vague consulting fees paid to unknown entities. I showed them photographs, the one of Brenda and Vic Palmero with the envelope, discreetly taken but clear. I presented affidavits from vendors who claimed they'd been pressured to inflate bids or offer incentives to secure HOA contracts. With each revelation, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Faces turned from wary to concerned, then to angry. Brenda attempted to interrupt several times. "These are outrageous lies," she declared. "This is a witch hunt." Each time, I calmly paused, looked at her, and then presented another piece of evidence. "Mrs. McMillan, perhaps you can explain this invoice from Executive Garden Solutions for $5,000 for premium floral installations at the community entrance?" Several long-term residents I spoke to don't recall any such installation. However, public records show Executive Garden Solutions is a registered business name, and the address is AP. Box you opened 2 years ago. A gasp went through the room. Brenda turned pale. That's a clerical error, a misunderstanding, and perhaps you can explain the consistent overpayment on the Shady Grove towing contract? I continued, pressing the advantage. Our analysis, based on industry standard rates and the volume of tows reported, many of which, like mine, were questionable, suggests the HOA has overpaid Shady Grove by an estimated $30,000 in the last 2 years alone. Coincidentally, Mr. Palmero, owner of Shady Grove, made a series of cash deposits into his personal accounts shortly after each quarterly HOA payment was made. And you, Mrs. McMillan, made several significant down payments on luxury items during those same periods. The murmurs grew louder, angrier. People were starting to talk openly amongst themselves, pointing at Brenda. Her two cronies on the board looked like they wanted the earth to swallow them. The turning point, the absolute nail in her coffin, came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, bless her emboldened heart, stood up. Her voice trembled, but it was clear. "Brenda," she said, "you find me for my wind chimes. You made me feel small. But this is stealing from all of us. From our homes. How could you?" That simple, heartfelt question seemed to break the dam. Other residents started to speak out, sharing their own stories of petty fines, of intimidation, of feeling powerless. Brenda tried to shout them down, but her voice was lost in the rising tide of communal outrage. Mr. Abernathy called for a vote of no confidence in Brenda McMillan as president, then for her immediate removal from the board, then for a full, independent forensic audit of all HOA finances for the past 6 years, and finally, for the immediate termination of the contract with Shady Grove Towing and a review of all existing vendor contracts. The voting was almost unanimous on all counts. As the results were read out, Brenda McMillan sat stunned, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. When a motion for her removal was confirmed, she finally erupted. "You can't do this to me. I built this community. I'll sue every single one of you. This is illegal." No one was listening. Mr. Abernathy, now acting as interim chair, calmly asked her to vacate the president's seat. She refused, until two large, no-nonsense residents stood up and politely but firmly suggested she might be more comfortable leaving. Humiliated, sputtering threats and accusations, Brenda McMillan was essentially escorted out of the clubhouse, her reign of terror over. A spontaneous burst of applause filled the room. It wasn't triumphant, more a sound of collective relief, of a burden lifted. The immediate aftermath was swift. An interim board was formed with Abernathy at the helm, including Sarah Davis and a couple of other respected residents. They immediately froze the contentious special assessment Brenda had proposed. The locks to the HOA office were changed that very night. As for me, I quietly passed my dossier, including the photographs and the financial trails, to a contact in the local police department's economic crimes unit. I also made an official statement regarding the towing incident and my subsequent findings. It was no longer just Mark Thorne, disgruntled resident. It was Special Agent Marcus Thorne providing information on suspected fraud and extortion. The local PD, already aware of Shady Grove's reputation, launched a formal investigation into both the towing company and Brenda McMillan's financial dealings. The independent audit of the HOA finances, when completed a few weeks later, was damning. It uncovered systematic embezzlement, fraudulent invoicing, and clear evidence of kickbacks totaling well over $100,000 over Brenda's tenure. Shady Grove Towing had its license suspended pending the investigation, and Vic Palmero was facing multiple charges. Brenda McMillan's downfall was complete and very public. She was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. Her assets were frozen. The beautiful house from which she'd lorded over Serene Meadows was eventually sold to cover legal fees and part of the restitution owed to the HOA. The last I heard, she'd moved out of state, disgraced and broke. Her enablers on the board quietly resigned and faded into obscurity, hoping to avoid further scrutiny. Serene Meadows began to heal. The new board, under Abernathy's steady guidance, implemented transparent financial practices and fair, clearly defined rules. They hired reputable local companies for services at competitive prices. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed palpably. People were friendlier, more relaxed. The oppressive cloud of Brenda's rule had lifted. Mrs. Henderson even put her wind chimes back up, and their gentle sound was a pleasant addition to the renewed peace. I finally got the quiet I'd been looking for, though in a way I hadn't anticipated. I hadn't set out to dismantle a petty tyrant's empire. I just wanted my car back and for the rules to be applied fairly. But one thing had led to another, and the skills I'd honed in the shadows of federal law enforcement found an unexpected application in the bright sunlight of suburban America. It was a different kind of satisfaction than closing a major case, but profound nonetheless. It was justice delivered not with a bang, but with the rustle of audited papers and the collective voice of a community finding its strength. My Ford LTD sat safely in my garage, a silent testament to the strange series of events. Sometimes when I took it for a drive, I'd think about Brenda, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of detached pity. She'd had power, and she'd let it corrupt her absolutely, all for the sake of control and a bit of ill-gotten cash. She underestimated the quiet new guy, never imagining that behind the unassuming facade was someone trained to see exactly what she was. And that, my friends, is how a power-tripping HOA president learned a very public lesson. It just goes to show you never really know who you're dealing with. And sometimes the smallest act of defiance against an injustice can unravel a whole rotten system. Abuse of power, no matter how petty the kingdom, can't stand forever against diligence and collective action. What do you think was the biggest mistake Brenda made? Apart from towing my car, of course. I'd be interested to read your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for letting me share my story. Stay safe and always read the fine print.